I'm Stephen Louie, and this is the GrowerIQ podcast. In our very first episode, we talked to Shlomo Booklin, commercial cannabis grow guru, about his first experience with medical cannabis and about his surprising career in the legal cannabis industry. Enjoy! I started off by asking Shlomo to tell us about his first exposure to cannabis.
I lived in Israel, and like every other Israeli, I had to, the army service is compulsory. And unfortunately, during that time, it was 82, 83, 84, it was the war between Israel and Lebanon. You're probably too young to remember that. However, it was a really, today it's still considered, that war still considered to be the same as what Vietnam did for the American. It's definitely divided the nation. It was a useless war. There was no war that had any justification, maybe political gain, but nothing, existing or essential in terms of, threatening the borders or any threat. It was like political war of the Israeli government against mostly the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They used to be a terrorist group, and they were basically stationed in the north of Lebanon, close to the north of Israel border. And it was more as a nuisance. And again, as I said, there was no really a justification to have the full deployment of the full Israeli army to kind of deal with a couple of guys with Kalashnikov. So, however, we did go there, and over the next 10 years, I wasn't there for the full 10 years, but over the next 10 years, probably next to 1,000 soldiers died for stupid and useless reason. And as I said, it divided the country. Still today, it's very, very deep scar in the Israeli history. During my army service, as war can be nasty, I was, facing a lot of scene or witnesses a lot of really bad things happen to very close colleague of mine, one really good friend of mine. We were hugging and used to be very, very good friend and close friend. He lost 2 legs, and I was too embarrassed to see him anymore. Another friend of mine, very close, we kind of slept in the same tent together, got a bullet in his head, and basically died on my shoulder.
Oh my God.
And, those couple of really, really horror stories that, basically I started to become, I had very bad reaction to this. At that time, obviously, no one knew what is PTSD mean. They basically called it shell shock, or what that was the kind of the
term for that kind of
condition. But basically, I was having a nightmare. I couldn't sleep for more than 10 minutes at night. I was afraid of the dark. I slept for 2 hours or for 10 minutes, and then I woke up screaming and sweating all over. It took me probably 4 hours to calm myself down and to remember that I was home, and then fell asleep again for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and woke up again. I remember having a girlfriend at that time, and she it happened to us twice. She was just lying on me in bed, and I was, dreaming there is a dead body sitting on me, and I pushed her all the way to the wall, with all my force, because I thought, I was dreaming that it's a dead body on me. And, after twice I did it to her, she basically said, you're a nutcase, and she dumped me. And I was definitely a nutcase, no doubt. I obviously didn't do it in purpose. And and the medication that the doctors gave me was basically made me into a zombie. I was walking, probably with a look of a cow on my face, and walking aimlessly without any reason, rhyme, or any purpose, just, killing time. During the night,
Right.
I was trying to sleep. I had to take a couple of pills. That kind of knocked me over. In the morning, probably 9 o'clock, I woke up, took another couple of pills, and as I said, walk around the house aimlessly, doing nothing. Really.
Were you able to work or study during that period?
Nothing.
Mm.
And I remember myself quoting myself one time, sitting in front of the washing machine and trying to change channel on the remote control.
Oh my God.
Thinking that it's TV. I couldn't care less what is the program.
Jeez.
We're laughing at it now, but
Oh, yeah, I can only imagine.
Just as I said, totally disconnected. So I was, as I said, caught myself sitting in front of the washing machine and trying to change channel with the remote control. And then I said, I realized that I hit rock bottom, as much as I had some kind of awareness of myself.
Right.
Something need to be done. Obviously, as a soldier, especially in Lebanon, and as a young kid, I used to have a lot of what they call hash. So we used to smoke a lot of hash, but it basically didn't do much to me. I just wasn't high. I remember my first time smoking hash. I was so off that I counted the tiles on the floor. And obviously when I get to 20, I didn't remember where I started, so I had to restart again and again. So hash didn't do much to me apart from definitely,
No kidding. Getting good tile counts.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't very productive. So that's what I remember about hash. And then at that some stage, my older brother said to me, "Why don't you try cannabis?" And I thought cannabis and hash is probably the same, and it is the same in a way, but probably cannabis is not as pure and intoxicated as hash.
Right. What gave your brother the idea?
I don't know. He was smoking on he was smoking. I don't know. He was older than me in 3.5, 4 years.
Okay, so he just had experience with it and figured you might as well try.
Yeah, so he gave it to me once, and I don't know. I mean, I managed to sleep well after I smoked it. So I smoked it for a couple of weeks without taking my so-called night medication, and I slept quite okay. And then I said to myself, "Wow, I don't need it anymore." And I'm okay.
Yeah.
And then probably 3-4 days later, I kind of hit it.
Went back to the old.
Started to creep back on me. So I remember I knew that I have to be on that kind of cannabis for longer. And my brother used to buy it for me. I don't know where did he get it. I don't know. He just bought it for me and gave it to me. I don't know where he got it and what was it even. But I know that he kind of we used to take some of the tobacco out of the cigarettes, and instead of putting the hash like we used to before, he put the leaves of the cannabis, just normal leaves. We didn't. I think at that time we didn't smoke the flower, we just smoking the leaves.
Really?
Yeah. We didn't smoke the.
And it was still potent enough to help.
Yeah, to sleep. Yeah, it wasn't potent enough to make me count the tiles, but.
Right.
But it definitely helped me sleeping. So again, it was
that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was probably very low dose, and the leaf probably, again, it's very hard for me to say.
Yeah.
At that some stage later, we basically we used to buy bird food in a supermarket, and basically going through the packet and collect the cannabis seeds out of that.
What?
Yeah. So
wow.
So we used to buy those food for birds bags, and then it was 200 to 300 grams. We used to take all the cannabis seeds out.
How many seeds would you have in one of those bags?
Probably 50, 100.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was, as I said, it's a bag, like, it's definitely 2-3 full handful of seeds.
Sure.
And we could definitely find 30, 50 of them random. We had to go over them, and we could see, by the shape, what is the cannabis and what is not. We used to germinate those plants or those seeds. And once they reached to about, 15, 20 centimeter, we took the leaves, we put them in the oven, dry them in the oven, in the kind of toaster.
Sure.
And then we crushed them and we put them in the cigarettes.
And it works. My gosh.
Yeah, it works. It works. So I like I said, after those 2 weeks, I kind of went back to smoking, especially at night. I used to smoke probably one or two cigarettes before I went to sleep, and it helped me sleep quite well. And I didn't need medication anymore. So after probably, I would say 2 or 3 months, I started to gain myself,
become your old self.
Yeah, became myself again.
Yeah.
I said to myself, okay, so what do I do with my life? And at that time, the Israeli government had a system that if you are a veteran soldier, the government will pay you your tuition in the university. So I went to that place where you can register as a released soldier, and they said to me, "Okay, so what do you want to study?" So I said, "I don't want anything to do with people. I don't want to see people. I want to be a vet. Let me, taking care of cats and sheep."
Sure, interesting.
Yeah, so they said to me that the vet program for that year is full already. But if I want, I can wait for the next year. I'll get definitely a spot for next year. And then they say, by the way, if you want to study agriculture, the tuition and unemployment for the whole duration of the course.
Sounds like a good deal.
So yeah, of course. So I said, where do I sign? And that's how I started to work in agriculture. I study. I was a good student. I had a good marks. And basically, probably after a year, after finishing the study, during the study, I definitely did smoke during the night to help me sleep. And then I started walking. So I was fairly tired. So after about a year, I said, I don't need it anymore. And I stopped both cigarettes and cannabis altogether. As I said, hash, I stopped even before that because, it just didn't resonate well with me. But,
sure. Were you able to maintain the quality of life afterwards?
Yeah. I mean, again, once I started to work and I had a good job and I had a good interest in life, I was very busy. I worked hard. Agriculture is a very physical, demanding job. So, working in nurseries or greenhouses all day in the heat makes you tired. So, as I said, probably after, I would say, a year, I don't remember exactly when, I basically stopped without even, taking into, making into a kind of, on that day, I'm going to stop smoking.
Right.
It happened that I just didn't need it anymore. And, you do it.
That sounds pretty good, actually. I mean, it helped you transition back.
Yeah.
It's not something you had to continue to take, for the rest of your life.
1 day or 3 days or 4 days, then I realized, well, actually, I haven't smoked for 2 days. Then probably I don't need it. So I stopped, and that's it. And I started to work in a very big facility in Israel, very big company. They exported to all over the world, and having a very good name in the industry. Probably a year later, I don't remember exactly the time now, but probably a year later, I got across someone that was looking for a grower in Australia. Actually, it was the commercial attaché for the Australian embassy in Israel, and I went to his house for a picnic. Actually, I knew his son, but I went to his son for a picnic, and then I got to talk to his father. And as I said, he was the commercial attaché to the Australian embassy in Israel, and he had a request from some company in Australia that they needed some Israeli grower. Obviously, Australia is a similar weather to Israel, in which it's very hot.
I imagine there's the same level of water scarcity.
Yeah, exactly. So the company that they had in Australia was actually importing glasshouse from Holland. So now the Dutch greenhouses are designed in a way that they keep the heat inside. So in Australia, it was 35 degrees outside, and it was 55 degrees inside. So then they realize that they need someone that have experience in working in a hot condition.
Sure.
And that's how they, as I said, got into contact with the Australian attaché in the commercial attaché in the Australian embassy. And basically, when that guy, heard what I do, and he knew where I worked, he asked me if I would consider speaking to those people in Australia. And obviously, as a young boy, very eager to see the world, how can I refuse it? So I spoke to them, and they basically hired me to come to Australia. We went there. At that time, I was already married. We went with I went there with my wife, and we stayed in Australia for 3.5 years. Our first son was born in Australia.
Oh.
Yes. So then after that, when the Australian project finished, we were looking for another project. I didn't want to go back to Israel because it's Israel is a beautiful place, but it's very politically charged.
Right.
You cannot really stay, immune, or you must take a stand either to the left or to the right. So
yeah, it must just permeate every facet of life.
Yeah,
there.
exactly. So it penetrates everything in your life. So basically, we didn't want to go back to Israel. Again, me, I don't want to go back to the old memories of war and
right.
Having to think that my son will have to go to the war because this is how the reality in Israel. I said, okay, let's try and find something else. And we came across the project in Portugal. It wasn't the same company, but just another company.
This podcast is brought to you by GrowerIQ, a compliant cannabis seed-to-sale and cultivation management platform. The first platform to integrate all facility systems like sensors, controls, QMS, and ERP, all into a single interface. GrowerIQ changes the way cultivators use software, transforming a regulatory requirement into a platform to learn, analyze, and improve performance.
So we moved to Portugal, and we lived in Portugal for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's a long time. Our second son was born in Portugal. And then we used to export a very big amount of plants, from Portugal, mostly to England and Holland. But, exporting into England, it's at that time, and still today, it's a very strict regulation of quarantine and what they call phytosanitarians. So you have to be on top of everything. You cannot, it's very strict regulation.
Right.
And so I did it as I said, for about 10 years. We export about probably 6, 7 to 8 million plants every season. It was very intense. It was an average of 250,000 plants a week. Everything has to work like a clock. Like you cannot really miss one, because I remember I had to book the truck a month in advance, but it took me 12 days to make the plans. So I already booked the truck 2 weeks before I have the plant in the ground. And, when the truck is coming, is it today? I cannot ask him, well, the plant is not ready, come tomorrow.
Right.
So it has to be very, very well organized.
You have to be very confident in your growing.
In the growing, and also very organized, because again, when you talk about this scale, you're obviously giving yourself probably more than 10% mortality rate. And if you have to produce and export 250,000 plants, you're probably going to make 270 or 280,000 and allow yourself some throwing away some 20, 30,000 plants. Which is nothing in the grand scale of things. As I said, we did it for about 10 years, and then the project was about to end. Most of those clients of mine, at that time, Portugal was just getting into the EU, or the part of the European Union. But so it was relatively cheap place to grow and work. It still is compared to the rest of Europe, but it started to be a little bit more expensive. And at that time, my competition was mostly in Kenya, Uganda, and Africa, or other places, because when you ship small plants, the airfare, whether it's 4 or 5 hours from Africa or 3 hours from Lisbon, it's relatively the same. So the cost of production is a factor, and I cannot compare the cost of production in Portugal compared to Kenya or Uganda. So my competition was starting to migrate to Africa, and that's where my contract in Portugal finished. We at that stage, I had a couple of offers. I had an offer to go to China. I had an offer to go to India. It was, after the second Gulf War. So the first Gulf War, it was 1991. So someone actually offered me to go to Kuwait.
Wow.
Yeah. Offer me, I don't know what kind of German fake passport or some kind of fake of German identity card. But my wife couldn't come with me. She had to stay somewhere else.
Right.
And
that makes things difficult.
Yeah, so my wife put a veto on all of those places. And we chose to come to Canada. So we immigrated to Canada in 2002. I worked a couple of years in BC. At that time, I lived in Vancouver. I lived about 8 years in Vancouver. And in 2009, after that big recession, the agriculture industry in Vancouver was, relatively decimated, because most of the Vancouver or the BC production went to across the border for Seattle and things like this. But when the recession hit America, and the dollar was par with the American dollar, there was not much of export to Seattle. And as I said, the industry in Vancouver was relatively decimated. So the only place I could find a job was here in Ontario. So we left BC and we moved to Ontario. I worked in Ontario. I don't know if you know, there's a very big company. It's called Sheridan Nursery.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh man, me and my mother spend way too much money at those garden centers. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So yeah, Sheridan Nursery is definitely a very large thing. So they have 10 or I think 11 garden center across the GTA. And they have a place in Georgetown where they produce everything for the garden center. So it was a very large scale facility, and I was the head grower there for a couple of years in Sheridan, as I said, in Georgetown. That was in around 2014, if I remember right. At that time, Tilray was the first LP that got a license. They had a couple of growers that knew how to grow 20 plants, 30 plants, one big master grower that grew 50 plants, but no one knows how to do 5,000 plants or 50,000 plants because it's definitely different scenario, different rhythm, different, everything. So they asked me to join them, and I moved in 2014. I moved to BC, to Nanaimo, to help them basically start the operation. I had to do the floor design, the floor plan, the room, the irrigation system. To me, it's still is agriculture project, and in the base of it, it is still the same. The plants need water, light, and condition to grow. So whether it's cucumbers, strawberries, or tomatoes, to me, it's a plant at the end of the day. So as I said, I did it. I joined Tilray for about a year, and I helped them set up the facility, mostly training people to take it in a professional manner, in way that it's not about weed and growing and smoking. And it's more about good production, good standard, good following.
Pipeline, making sure things are compliant.
And to make the production as smooth as possible. If you can save 5 seconds from a plant, once you multiply it by 50,000 plants, it's 2 men's job or 2 full-time job. So basically, that was my role there. I had a lot of conflict with the traditional grower because they don't know what calcium is, what potassium is, what everything, because they grew all their life cannabis, and they don't really accept me as outsider to tell them how to grow cannabis, because I never smoked it, and I never I remember one of the guys there was so proud of his record in the cannabis industry that he also said that he was also 2 years in jail because of that. So,
and he's proud of that.
He's proud of that. Yeah, it's part of his curriculum that he was 2 years in jail. So it for him it's a show of having the.
It's a badge of honor. Yeah. So that's an interesting point. So a lot of Canadian growers and American growers, or all these new growers or facilities, they have this tension between sort of former black market growers, and then they try to bring in proper horticulturalists. How do you see that dynamic? Is that a healthy tension at all, or is that
no? Because they, again, I don't have anything personally against them, but they lack of basic understanding of plant nutrition, plant health, and the whole concept of rules and regulation is weird to them.
Right.
They never did it. They never had to comply with any rules. So you don't tell me now what to do. I do it. I did it for the last 20 years or 15 years or 10 years, and I never had a problem of selling my my product, you cannot tell me now that I cannot do that and I cannot do that. So
right.
It's very, very, and still today, I am no disrespect, but, I don't have any tattoos. I don't smoke. Well, I don't smoke today. I smoked when I was, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I don't, belong to the same culture of,
Right.
this and this and, I am very, very professional grower. I know that the plant needs calcium, potassium, nitrogen, whatever. I know how to recognize those, deficiency, or if there is too much. I know how to do, soil analysis. I know how to read report from the lab. It's technical, it's scientific. It's just, this is what I learned.
Exactly.
But
and perhaps most importantly, you know how to do that at scale.
Yeah. So, and again, when I speak to someone and his assessment is how the plant look and how the plant smell. Again, no disrespect, but you cannot spray this, you cannot spray that, you cannot, just feel like you're giving this kind of, fertilize because that's what you think is the best thing. I mean, I worked in a very analytical and, as I said, a scientific way. If I do soil analysis and it shows that I have lack of calcium, I will give calcium. I don't care what,
Right.
because this is the result from the lab.
Right.
And obviously, if I see the leaves steady getting a little bit yellowish, and I recognize that it's a lack of iron, then I'm going to give some iron to the plants because this is what I do. And it doesn't really matter if it's tomatoes or anything else. I mean, if my job as a grower or anything else is to produce, 40,000 kilos of tomatoes for Sobeys, I don't need to bite each one of them to make sure it's yummy and it's good. I have other methods to make sure that they're good, and I have to comply with save and food save of when is the last time I can spray before the harvest and anything like this, because I have responsibility to the customer.
Shlomo, that was kind of your story on how you got into cannabis. Did you ever think at the beginning of all of this that you would end up in cannabis?
No, never. I mean, again, when my as I started to tell you, I was actually planning to be a vet. So
right, so it could have gone quite differently.
Yeah, so it's sometimes life gives you turns that you don't really expect. I would never think that I would grow cannabis again. For me at that time, especially 30 years ago, cannabis was kind of something that you hide from your parents. Even though it helped me a lot, my parents never approved, or I didn't even bother to tell them what I do.
Right.
Smoking,
and I'm sure even your peers, there must have been people you didn't want to tell about.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not something I was proud of, and as I said, it's something that I do like everything that you do as a teenager. If you smoke or drink or go to party, you kind of grow up out of it, and it's a kind of phase in your life. So I never thought that cannabis is going to be a crop. I would never plan to do that. And probably, with all honesty, if it wasn't for Tilray, I probably wouldn't got into it. I don't know. I mean, as I said, I just basically, always I was very ambitious and I wanted to be good in what I'm doing. And when I finished with Tilray, I came back to Ontario and I joined another company called MedRelief. They're also very, very big, and they also grew. And as it happened that after working a year at Tilray and another year at MedRelief, I became like a, superstar.
Yeah.
Having, both of those companies under my so-called belt, I became very popular and again had a very good name. I had lots of companies wanted me to help them with the application, with production planning, with, to be a master grower, whatever you want to call it. And I worked with a couple of them, and they all basically wanted to keep me for themselves. I'm not allowed to speak to anyone. It's that mentality of the cannabis industry that, if I have something better than you, then I must not tell you about it.
Right.
So I was not allowed to speak to anyone apart from my peers at those companies. And that's, I thrive with human interaction. I thrive with talking to, colleagues. At that time that I was at Tilray, I had a very good friend. His name is Ryan Douglas. He was the master grower for Tilray, for Canopy. And although we worked for, very fierce competition between Tilray and Canopy, we, on a personal level, we got very well. We had the same issues. We had the same difficulties. We had to deal with the same sort of old-fashioned, growers that didn't want to look at the, calcium and potassium. So, those are the things that we kind of shared without necessarily telling him about Tilray bank account, and he's telling
sure,
kind of
marketing strategies. And
so just collaborating with colleagues as pure, enriching.
Right.
So at that stage, I started to, to think to myself, well, there's too many people who wants my help. I'm not allowed to talk to them because then I'm in breach of contract. Why would I just quit and become a consultant? And of course, it's not as easy as it sounds. You start giving advice to people. They never pay you. They always say that they will pay you later. And, there was one guy that ran out of money and he wanted to give me shares instead of payment. And, I told him,
classic.
it's monopoly money, whether it's 5% or 50%. If the company awards zero, it's still zero.
Exactly.
Again, I had to go through a couple of those, places where you work hard and definitely don't get anything for it. So, and you basically get kind of, I would say, nose to start see the difference between the BS and the genuine people.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, that's how I started.
That was Shlomo Booklin, who chatted with us about his introduction to cannabis and his unlikely career in legal cannabis cultivation. Stay tuned for our second episode where we continue to chat with Shlomo about the medicinal future of the plant and growing it internationally.